The history actually has been told, or can be told, very briefly, because there's only been about 5 people or 5 families owning it. It was originally built in 1832 by a Bavarian war hero, a Feldmarschall, and his name was Provocher, and he called it Villa Provocher. It was a house back then already with 16 guest rooms with thermal water, and he apparently fell in love with another woman, not the one he was married to, and so 60 years later he gave this house as a present to his second love in life, and she decided to sell it to Mr. Weismeier in 1886. And Mr. Weismeier tore down the whole building to the level of the street that's passing by here. So everything lower than the reception, like this pool and the spa area, is originated in 1832. And it was rebuilt then from up there in 1888. And so everything we're looking at today is originated in 1888. And back then the tourist industry in Badgastein was only tourists for the summer. The houses did barely have any heating, and they were open for guests during the time of May to September, and the hotel owners were working very hard during that time. The rest of the year they only were going for hunting, they were drinking and playing cards, and they were also losing their hotels by playing cards, and that's apparently what happened to Mr. Weismeier. In the late 1920s he lost this house by playing cards to a Salzburgian owner of a coffee place. And so this guy became the owner of the hotel, and he was a heavy card player himself, and a few years later he had to give it up to the Bank of Salzburg. And the Bank of Salzburg sold it to a Jewish family, to the Familie Hübner. And that was right at the time where the Nazis came to Austria, so they never really got the title in the books of companies settled of this property. And so by the end of the Second World War they hired a lawyer, and that lawyer was very successful in gaining back the properties that were taken away by the Nazis from the family Hübner, and he apparently made them an offer. He said, you know what, I fought many successful titles for you, so I have already a very large bill. Let's do the following. The title on the Hotel Weismeier is not really 100%. If I win the battle, it should be my part of what I did for you, and if I lose it, you don't owe me anything. And the Hübners went for that deal, and he won it. And so since the late 1950s, the family Lovacek then, this was the name of the lawyer, was the owner of this property. And Mr. Lovacek was a very active man. He was already eating Spanish fly in the 1960s, and he was having a girlfriend here in Badgastein, and he later on married her daughter. So out of this marriage, he had 3 sons, and when he died in the age of 96, he inherited the hotel to one of his sons, and that was in 1992. And that son grew up in Vienna and didn't really know what to do with a hotel in Badgastein, and so my wife and me came along and got lucky and were able to buy it in 1995, and that's how we worked it a quarter of a century. The valley of Gastein, especially Badgastein, has had several economic peaks during the past 1,000 years. So the second big economic peak is the tourist industry, which we are still in now. The first one was mining for gold and silver. This was in the 14th and 15th century, and it was very impressive because 12 to 15,000 miners were employed in the town of Gastein. Now there is less people in the population in the whole valley, so it was a heavy industry here. But then when the gold and silver was harder to be digged out of the mountains, it became quiet again, and a lot of agriculture happened here. And in the beginning of the 19th century, the kings and emperors from whole Europe and from the whole world came to Badgastein for the famous warm water, for the thermal water. It was called the youth, the spring of youth, and it was called the most beautiful resort in the Alps. And usually when you look at the older buildings here, they are all originating around 1800, 1820, 1830. And until 1920, about the end of the First World War, it was that Badgastein faced also a difficult time for the first time, because the kings and emperors were not anymore all over Europe spread, so it became more a casual tourist town. And during the Second World War, it was that Badgastein became a big hospice Many injured soldiers came here for treatment, and then in the late 1960s we started to build the winter destination Badgastein. Many houses did not have any heating until then, and so it was a big change for the houses to be put in the position to host guests during the winter time. And that started in the 1960s, 1970s, and was pretty much completed by the 1990s. And in the 1990s, we had already 1.3 million guest nights per year. So that was the first peak. At the same time, we also had a lot of people coming here from insurance companies being treated for health issues. And in the late 1990s, these health issues by the insurance companies were not covered anymore. So guest nights dropped down dramatically. Already having averaged 1.2, almost 1.3 guest nights in the beginning of the 1990s, by 1997 these guest nights did get cut almost in half, down to 600, 700,000 guest nights. And that put the industry into a big problem, and some of the hotels that are still not operating now basically went bankruptcy at that time. So that was a hard time from 1995, from the year 2000 until I would say 2015. And for the last 5 years we have seen big investments, and people started to, how should I say, find back their love for Badgastein. Badgastein was always known as the sleeping giant because it has such a great infrastructure, such a beautiful landscape, and such a beautiful infrastructure as hotels. But for, I would say, the 1990s, for 2 decades or so, people were not really into the old houses, and they didn't like the imperial style. And that has changed, and with that investments came back, and now everything is booming. So in 1995, when my wife and me purchased the hotel, we purchased the hotel during the prime time where the insurance companies were sending their customers for treatment to Badgastein. And also in the Hotel Weismeier, we had 80% of people coming here for medical treatment. And that, of course, disappeared after 5 years. And we had to, how should I say, reposition the hotel on the market. So we started to sell it more in a way for tourists, not so much for people that come here for medical care. And that has been basically happening since the year 2000. And we were very happy to get in contact with the Selina company. We saw some hotels from them in South America, and we were just thrilled what they do with this kind of properties that have this history, and they really bring out the feeling of it. So we just very happy to have signed the contract with Selina in 2019, and it has been undergoing a great conversion, and we couldn't have done it better. We are very happy.